So I think it depends on what your role is in the company. So if you're a tier 0 admin, you probably want to be device bound because, yes, it's inconvenient, it takes time, but it provides the extra protection. On the other hand, if you're a frontline user,
Yes.
Syncable all the way because that
Yeah.
will make your life easier and make your help desk life easier and in the end increase productivity. The old way where were very network centric or endpoint centric doesn't really work on identities. And you need to kind of move to a more kind of fluid battlefield where you accept the fact that the attacker is going to be able to compromise identities, unfortunately, unless.
Intro Chat with Merrill's live, digging deep where techs thrive. From the latest hacks to cool updates, join the ride, don't be late.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Entra Chat. Today, I'm really happy to have Martin Sandren. He's the product lead for identity and access at none other than IKEA. And we're going to go into a lot of things, as always, all about Entra, Martin's journey and how it's entangled with IAM and Entra, and what Martin sees as, challenges and how he's overcome them. And hopefully you will all learn a lot more about implementing Entra and IAM in general. Martin, you want to give a quick intro?
Sure. Thanks for having me here. So my name is Martin Sandren. I'm the product lead for Identity and Access at IKEA. And most people know what IKEA is. We do round meatballs and flat packages across the globe.
Absolutely.
For the many.
And my kids love the meatballs. So we go to IKEA just for the meatballs.
Yeah, that's a way we kind of, we lure our customers in and then they somehow, before they leave, they somehow have a full car of stuff. It's very strange.
Absolutely. Always.
So I'm originally from Sweden and I've lived, across the globe a bit in Germany, UK, US, and now in the Netherlands, where I'm living here in Amsterdam since 2013.
Wow. So is Amsterdam your place, the place you settled on?
Yeah, my kids like it here, and it's a good place to live. We'll see. My wife is American, so we'll see where we will end up. If we will stay forever in Amsterdam, or we will go somewhere else.
Of course. Cool. Awesome. So tell us about your journey so far.
Yeah, it's always a bit fun to talk about the first time you went into Entra, and actually the first time I heard about Entra was at Gartner back like 2016 or something.
Right.
And there was some form of announcement that the on-premise version was going to be phased out in favor of an online version. And I was thinking that at that time this was not the common thing to do. It was a bit fun. I don't know if it was first, but it was definitely one of the first big changes.
Definitely.
So
going all cloud, right? Pure
yeah,
cloud was a really early start with Entra.
So then it was a few more years before I started using it, and actually it was a bit fun because I was at that time working as a consultant for a global retailer, not IKEA, another food retailer. And we have spent 3 years migrating off a very kind of custom grown stack of access management products into ISAM, because the idea was that we were going to go on the IBM stack with everything. So we spent 3 years doing this, and we were very kind of happy when we managed to get to the end.
Right.
And then 3 months later, we're told that, well, we have now merged with another firm, and we have decided that our strategic platform is Microsoft. So get started moving again.
After 3, was it 2 years or
3 years?
3 years
migration.
Wow.
We then started the migration over to the Entra platform.
Right.
And
did you merge the 10? So you merged the users and the apps in. You brought them over into the other Entra tenant that you acquired.
So we had was a very large. Well, we had about 800,000 internal users, which is quite large. There are a few ones that are bigger.
Yeah, I don't. I think there'll be just maybe a handful or, the hundreds tenants of that size.
Yeah. So that, of course, came with some challenges. It's always when you're in the extreme end of the spectrum,
Yes.
then you run into problems that no one else has and no one
Yeah.
really thought you run into. So
Very unique ones. And this was back in 2016,
2020 around, something
2020.
2019, 2020 somewhere.
Right. Got it.
So the first thing when I started looking into Entra, I discovered that one feature that was really, really impressive was the fact that you could actually easily see why a user was, when they signed in or not. Because historically, you've always had like rec logs on, request
Right.
logs. But if you have a kind of conventional build, you might have 4 or 8 or 16 or 32 even nodes where the users can log in, depending on if they're internal, external, US side, Europe side, Asia Pacific.
Right.
So getting the full picture for a specific user can be quite complex. While in Entra, it's just, click, click, and then you have it. It was fantastic. It was really,
nice.
really, really good feature. Really helped with the troubleshooting.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. You needed to be geo regional, right? When you have things on-prem and need to be spread out, and Entra does all of this for you in the cloud. And the users get taken to the closest node, that the data center that they sign in from. Yeah, and you just get that for free. Even on the free tenants, you get I think we get 7 days to 30 days of logs, depending on the licensing. Nice.
And I do think that there's a number of things that Entra has done really well. So one thing that is kind of a new concept is if you look at the private preview, the public preview, and GA, that gives you ability to try out a new idea. Wouldn't it be nice if X works? And the big problem you normally have in product management is that if it takes you, usually you have kind of 1 to 2 years of lead time of features you have promised someone.
Right.
But with this private preview, you can launch it, you could try out an idea, and everyone involved knows that if it turns out that the idea was not either technically not feasible, or it just didn't connect with the overall direction you want to take the stack, or if there was no commercial potential in the idea, it's going to be dropped. So the fact that you kind of embrace this, it really is a huge advantage compared to the old way we used to do things.
Yes, and when you're in the cloud, you need to have that, right? Being able to try out new features in production. And for listeners who don't know these terms, this concept of a private preview, then public preview, and then GA or general availability. So private preview is sort of like the first ring of external tenants getting access to features. And usually it's shared under NDA, right? A non-disclosure agreement where Microsoft tests these new features with very large customers and like customers where it applies to them. And we do sort of like a private pilot testing, get feedback. And there have been many times where we build features and they never went past private preview based on, the feedback we get from customers. But most of the time after private preview, we end up going into public preview. And that's when the rest of the world gets to know about this new feature and you can test it. It's not fully supported yet because Microsoft is still, getting ready. The support team is ready, multilingual, and the docs and fleshing those out and so on. So yeah, and obviously with large tenants like yours, when you're working on them, you do get access to work with Microsoft on those private preview features, especially ones that are critical to your success.
Yeah, I think this is a very good setup, and I know that's become more or less standard in the business. But I think that you were one of the, at least the early adopters of the concept, if you weren't the first pioneers on it. Another feature where I think it's partly Microsoft, it's also partly we as an industry, is if you look at the SAML and the OIDC integrations, they're so easy nowadays. I remember doing the first federation back in 2001. This was before SAML existed, and
right.
we did a connection between two ERP systems, and we spent probably like 150 days or something in total, because
Wow.
we had to
Yes.
kind of design it. We got our crypto books back from university, and we kind of talked about it, and we got it working. But if you compare today, where normally when we do a SAML integration or an OIDC integration, it's a few hours of technical work.
Yes.
The
And you're done,
requester
right?
fills out a
Yes.
form, or even there's an automated integration that builds them in the overall DevOps setup, and then it just works.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like that's where there's a big jump, right? I remember back in 2000, in the early 2000s, I was building a .NET application for a SaaS startup, and we had to write SAML. They said, no, build this in SAML 1. We need to get single sign-on using SAML, and there were no C# libraries. So we actually paid a vendor who had uh, like a core thing of SAML, and they built a library, and we had to pay for that. I think it was called Component One or something, and then we bought it from them and then deployed it, because as a dev, we didn't have enough of the knowledge or the time to be building, SAML compliant libraries to work on all of this.
Yeah, and if you haven't really been back in the bad old days, like I remember in about 15 years ago, we did implementations of SAML, and then we spent about 50 days per implementation, because
Yes.
you could run into things like you had an IBM implementation on one side and a Microsoft on one side, and
Right.
the IBM and the Microsoft had a bit of a different idea of how to pad
Implement this,
certain
right?
things down
Yes.
in the, or you might run into a situation where you couldn't find a correlating a crypto implementation that was the same on both sides, or this small things that takes 10-15 days to figure out that and this was the problem.
Yes, yeah, because we were building on different languages, different technology stacks, Java on one side, and I mean the standards were supposed to make those easier, but then when it came to implementing it, it was a different story. That's true.
Yeah, and of course it would be good to one day get out of SAML, especially given the complexities that SAML is the gift that keeps on giving for the hackers, that
Yes,
there's always more complexity in the canonization, for example, and so on. So, but
absolutely.
fundamentally it works, and usually it's quite stable nowadays.
Yes, that's true. And the other thing you always had to do when you did a SAML project, even as recently when I was working in enterprise in Australia, is we had to send the user identities. Sometimes for the app to work, it needs to know, who the users are, their title, and be able to do things. And so you'd have to set up another FTP process to send a daily CSV upload, and they would download it and import to the app. And yeah, so each integration would take like easily 2-3 months going into all of that. And now you have the beauty of SCIM and other things. It's still not as widely adopted as it could be, but it is improving.
Yeah, of course I think about 90% of all implementations today are usually just in time, and that works
Yes.
great for
Yeah.
everything that doesn't have an expensive license or a privacy concern or a perhaps financial integrity concern. And SCIM is also a really nice protocol, and I think it's one of the examples where the industry first tried something that was quite complex with
Yes.
SPML, and then we concluded that that was too complex for us. We'll
Yes.
do something simpler, and it is a huge difference, because usually if you have a SCIM integration, you can usually spend, say, 2, 3, 4 days on it, and it works.
Yes.
It
Yeah.
it does have its, like, it still doesn't like when you switch primary identifier, for example, but you
Right.
can
Yeah.
one can understand that that is not so easy to
That's
solve.
true. Yeah.
But generally it works great, and it's a lot less effort than doing a full kind of IGA, like you said, with an FTP of data, or database connection or anything. It limits your choices, which means that things get a lot more straightforward.
Right. Yeah. And that's one of the things with Entra. We do limit choices, which makes it a lot simpler to in the long run to maintain, you might feel like you're giving up some things as you go, like, why can't I do this? But I think that's part of the cloud story. And I've learned overall with Microsoft 365 as well. I come from a SharePoint world, and we used to be like deploying SharePoint on servers, and we would customize it all, spend like a year customizing SharePoint, branding it, and all of that. Then when you move to SharePoint Online, like, you couldn't touch anything. Microsoft said, no, you just have the docs. You can maybe put a logo, and that's about it, right? You couldn't even pick a color when they first launched. But then everyone moved over, and you don't spend that cycles, doing that. And when a new version comes, you'd spend 3 to 6 months and sometimes millions of dollars just upgrading servers. And that's another thing we see with Entra as well. People are, companies are like, why should I spend, millions on upgrading to the next version of whatever the on-prem solution I have? I already have Entra. Let me just switch over to that in this new day of, cost savings and so on. It's an important thing.
Yeah, if you look at in general, all kind of, we're talking about IGA or whatever technology we look at, of course, the advantage of cloud is firstly that you get in on-premise technology, you usually have a 3 to 5 year cycle between I have a good idea. It takes 1 to 2 years before I can get it executed. It takes a year to implement and test it. Then the packages get ready. They need to be implemented by someone and tested, and then you have a function at the end of the day. While with in the cloud, you can have it in 3, 6, perhaps 12 months new functionalities from the time when people think about it.
And with identity governance, it's the same, right? Like, companies are moving a lot more faster now. You're acquiring companies, divesting, and it's not like over 5 years. It's happening in the space of months. Sometimes you acquire, and then you need people to collaborate and work. And I think with a lot of the Microsoft investment with multi-tenant organizations and all are to basically help in those areas, right? To reduce that friction when you manage multiple tenants.
It is, of course, if you work with the right system integrator or right software package, you can do a kind of a hybrid approach where you put everything in CI/CD pipelines and put all your config in GitHub or someone like that, and then you can even put it onto Azure or another cloud platform, so you can just build everything. And we had some really bad implementation of that over the years. It's been used to be very hard to get to work, but I've seen some really good ones as well now that are more mature, where it used to be that if you had an IGA upgrade that was not a major version but a middle version, you can easily spend 30, 40, 50 days on one of these. Nowadays, I think the last one I did, we took us less than 5 days because it took us 2 months in calendar time because we upgraded first, and then we tested and then we pushed it out. But the integrated CI/CD stack, the pipelines, and having all the test cases ready to go for regression testing, automated, does help a lot. But of course, that requires that you work with a quite mature partner, because building all of that custom for just you would be horribly expensive and maintaining it. So you need to find a partner that does this on scale.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's where regression, and you need to treat it like it's a software, like a package, right? Your own, it's not custom code, but it's your configuration and your business rules for all of the HR information.
I think another very impressive, of course, is all conditional access. We can take a bit of a deeper look into that later, but also the concept of the stack of a platform. And of course, there it's always a little bit of a double-edged sword, because if you're a kind of an SMB, it makes a lot of sense to say, we use Microsoft as our primary platforms. We do Microsoft first. Obviously, when you become an enterprise, it becomes a bit more complex, because most likely you have more complex needs, which means that it's harder to go for a Microsoft only or a Microsoft first, because you're going to find business units or operations that just have different needs from your bread and butter part.
Absolutely, right. And you have like legacy protocols, legacy technologies that you still need to support, and applications that are still running there. And and there are different scenarios where you might not have like internet connectivity for certain use cases and so on. So yeah, those for those you need to carve out those applications until they're ready to move to the cloud, which might be many years and even down the line, right? For lots of
Yeah, and
services.
also, of course, there's resilience cases. So perhaps a bit less for IKEA, but I have some colleagues in, for example, to take a concrete example, the building material trade, and they're of course a critical components that if a hurricane goes through an area, the first thing people need to be able to get their chainsaws or their the plywood sheets to be able to
Yes, to
secure
be able to. Oh, I never
their
thought of
houses.
that. Yeah, that's true.
So then, of course, they need to be able to operate, even if they don't have any power or any internet. So there you have a strong need for being able to operating offline as well.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I come from two islands, like Sri Lanka, and Australia is a continent on its own. And we rely on cables that connect us to the rest of the world. And there's a lot of resilience in there, but yeah, it's very hard to know what can happen today when you suddenly lose all internet. There's always a story where something happens in the DNS somewhere in the world, and then somewhere else the issues happen. So it's definitely something that you need to plan for, right?
Yeah, and it is funny on the resilience side that DNS, for example, is one of these things that we had. A friend of mine had an issue a while ago where he lost the DNS, and then, well,
Right.
what is the IP of my the trigger IP for the trigger URL to get into your IGA system? Well, I probably should have that on a paper somewhere.
Right. Yes.
But then you have to have it on a paper that you update when you switch.
Exactly.
So interesting problems.
Yeah.
But I do like the fact also that if you go for a mostly Microsoft, you have the big advantage that you can. There is a lot of very useful integrations with Intune and Sentinel and entire stack there, and a lot of things that you can do easily, and things that there are some emerging standards, but that's still kind of in the emerging parts. So the things you can do today, if you have a mostly Microsoft stack or mostly one of the other stack vendors, is still a quite unique selling point.
Yes, and there's always that integration that's built in, even with lots of the other vendors and partners and integrations. And with identity, that's one of the things when we moved to Azure AD and Entra was to make sure it was all built on standards, because on the internet, that's the only way to interoperate and be successful, right? For customers to be successful as well.
Another area I really like what you've been doing is the guest users. So the concept of the guest user,
Yes.
it does create a little bit of a challenge because some of the applications requires guest users. You cannot use standard protocols like a SAML or a OIDC into the tenant. You need to have a guest user, which does create some problems when you need to have applications available for very large volumes of users.
Right. And with guest, what sort of governance do you have on those guest identities?
So that is, of course, also a bit of a challenge. How do you govern your guests?
Yes.
Because especially there's different parts of the Microsoft stack that creates the guest. So you could say that, for the kind of the identity created guest, you could say that everyone needs to have a sponsor. At least then you can ask the sponsor, hey, does this user need to be here?
Yes.
But some other parts they don't. And it's of course hard to enforce a rule that you need to have a sponsor.
Right.
So the only thing I've seen is that you can delete them if you have inactivity.
Right.
And
Inactive.
but that's a bit of also a double-edged sword, because let's say you have an application that is only used once a quarter or once a year.
Right.
And if the guest users are built quite complexly with lots of group memberships and stuff,
Yeah.
then it's not so fun when you do your yearly process and see that you lost all the users you created.
Absolutely. Yeah. With the guest identities.
And there is some kind of implicit things that it can be a bit hard to kind of forecast. So there are certain parts of the system where if you make an application available to all,
Yes.
that means that you can never make it available to guests.
Right.
So I think one good rule is to always use a group to control the access. Obviously, the other way around would also be a bit dangerous. That historically it's been a bit of a problem that you had lots of things that were available to all, including
To all,
guests,
yes.
and then
Yeah.
a guest comes in and start enumerating. This, of course, is a little bit also the challenge with AI is that the AI is able to kind of go out and look
Do
for
the
stuff.
work for them, right? As we get like Copilot and you have agents now being able to do the work, it's a lot more easier. And it's something that it's in the docs, and we recommend as well, right? To always make sure you give least privilege, right? A person should only have access to the app if they need to. Like if it's an HR app that only the HR team uses, then it should be scoped down to just those users, and you have governance. You apply on that even to teams and group sites and applications as well.
And you have the entire world of the cross-tenant sync, etc. And I think there it's important to really, because this is kind of concepts that are evolving, and the guidance from Microsoft is also partly evolving about how to do things. So it's really important to keep up on what's the latest and greatest information. So, for example, the guidance now, per my understanding, you should use cross-tenant sync within your organization, but you shouldn't use it across organizations.
Correct.
And there's this new concept, connected organizations, that has come in. That is now the way to do cross-organization integrations.
Yes, especially if we are like working closely with them and they are using, you can have a sponsor on the other side who you can nominate and they can manage. So if you have like large tier vendors that you work closely with, you would use that model with the connected organization.
So I have to admit that I need to read up a little bit more on that specific item.
Yeah, that feature is actually was one of the very earliest features in Entra in Azure AD itself for being able to do guests and so on. But it's a very handy, useful feature that it's meant for like specific use cases. Whereas the standard guest is a lot more open and a lot more easier to use. There's no upfront setup.
And of course, the guest accounts are a little bit like, Schrodinger's cat. You don't really know if they still are active or not, because you don't know until they log in to see if they still exist on the other side.
Correct.
And if you use the email-based guest, of course, then you lose a little bit of that as well, as long as the email address is active. Of course, you could see if you have an email address at a partner company.
Yes.
And you do also get a little bit of the problem with Schrodinger's cat's cousin or twin, that if a person shows up that has the same name, is that then the same person as the guest? And should you have both a member and a guest? Because there are, of course, certain business cases where that is a valid case. If you have a situation where your two organizations work together, they might say that, okay, you get a guest account on the other side to do guest work, but then the same person might come in as a contractor to the second organization.
Yes. And now they're a member as well. And then when people message them, you will see the same name, of course, with a different email, but you wouldn't know, right?
And you get a lot of problems that people give the entitlements to the wrong, to the guest instead of the member, or vice versa. And it's a bit, because of the fact that there are really valid business cases where this should be the case, it does become a bit complex.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. And even for people who might be initially a guest and maybe then they are recruited in, and then you have, those two identities hanging. So if you don't really clean up or lifecycle govern the guests, you will end up, with more of those issues. And the neat thing I like with E5 and the P2 licensing is the 1 to 5 model, where you can use that for all the guest capabilities. And that's a neat hack, right? So even we have the other model, which is 50,000 monthly active users. You can just get one P2 license and be able to have like that many monthly active guests and make use of all these access reviews and like the core part of identity governance. And then as you outgrow that, you can move into the Entra ID governance
Yeah.
suite of.
And it is really nice, the general principle that if you have rights, as long as it's in the same organization, that if you have a P2 license in one of your tenants, you
Yes.
can leverage that in the other tenants again. That is a really nice feature. So it's really appreciated that you're allowing.
Yeah, that's I love that. It's because it's a sort of valid thing, right? Like you, Alex Simmons says it's license per heartbeat, right? So you only have to get one Entra license per heartbeat, and that person can have any number of accounts in one directory or in multiple directories and be able to use those features for Entra ID P1 and P2. Yeah.
Another really powerful thing is the CA policy side. I think you've done a really good job there. The only challenge is that you have given the community a very powerful tool that is very easy to get yourself lost in because of the multi-dimensionality of CA policies, that it can be, do you get MFA or not? Do you get session length? Do you get this? Do you get that? Do you get an exception because you're on premise from an egress perspective, specific application exceptions?
Yes.
It is very, very easy to shoot yourself in the foot with CA policies when you build them.
Correct. Yeah. So how do you manage like when you what's your sort of philosophy when you work with your team?
Well,
on the
I
conditional
think
access
the
policy?
first part is to really leverage the best practice from Microsoft when you name your policies, because that means that you can bring in someone from like outside and they don't have to spend 2 months to learn your naming conventions or way of working. They can kind of understand it. I do like the tiering approach as well. So you have your tier 0, your tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. That helps a lot to be able to have the conversations between different, because I think one of the major challenges that you have the application teams, you have the developers, you have the business, you have the cybersecurity, and you have IAM. And
Yes.
a lot of these groups are not really used to talking together, like
Yes.
to each other. So one of the major challenges is just trying to get a common language and a common way to work together.
Right.
Because when you talk to people, one thing I think we see as an industry is the fact that the old way where were very network centric or endpoint centric doesn't really work on identities, and you need to kind of move to a more kind of fluid battlefield where you accept the fact that the attacker is going to be able to compromise identities, unfortunately, unless it's like having a very hard shell.
Yes.
You're not going to have a hard enough shell so that you at 100% of the time always keep the attackers from compromising identity. So what it becomes then is to make sure you have a defense in depth, so that yes, the attacker managed to compromise identity. What speed bumps we put in place so that the cyber team can discover that, hey, there's something weird going on, so that you slow down the attacker and you force him to create signal that can be seen and be picked up. That is very important as well.
Correct. Yeah. You sort of layer these things in, right? And you have multiple ways. So even if you sort of exclude users from one policy to meet a business need, you have other ways to track how they come through, and you sort of limit how much you're exposed to when you grant access. That.
Yeah, and accept the fact that different parts of your business is going to be different. You might have people who work in frontline users, who work in a factory or work in a retail store.
Yeah.
And they really need to have a very convenient way of working, because they're working at a factory. They have big gloves on, or they might have respiratory masks or something like that. And there you cannot really require them to kind of put in MFA codes. And
yeah, exactly. How do you handle that? Like, and even buildings they're sort of like an enclosure, right? An aluminum enclosure, and you can't even get, signals in through that, and wiring is not that possible.
So there is, I think you need to take a 360-degree view of this and say, okay, if you are a frontline worker, you probably, you work at a machine, so you can use the egress IPs, gives you some protection there.
Right.
You can also see that, do really all users always have to have access to everything? Like, does a machine
That's
operator
true.
really need to have access,
Absolutely.
ability to request? If they start going into the treasury systems, there's
Yes,
probably something that is going on that shouldn't happen.
that's true.
So you kind of need to look at what all signal can I take in,
Right.
everything from, where are you, what kind of device do you use, usage patterns compared to your peers. And
Yes.
I do really like the ITDR parts there. You kind of have to really tune your the ITDR agents, risky user, and so on to get
Yes.
good signal. Because if you
Yeah.
don't tune, then you're gonna get so many false positive from it.
Right.
But it really is, and what I really recommend is also to do the red teaming exercise and the purple teaming exercise and really see, put on the hacker's hat and really understand how they get in.
Right.
And it is very impressive where, you're part of the purple team exercise and you send out your, for example, if you do a purple team with phishing, you send out the phishing emails, and then you see,
Right.
after 2 minutes, you start getting the phishing email reports on this phishing email, and then
Right.
you probably do also get some that's going to be compromised, and then you can see, well, yes, it's compromised, but then your attacker that you have hired, he sits in the UK, and the user always comes in from Sweden or something like that, and then the risky user goes high. Like, yes, it works.
Yes. It's beautiful when you can see all that happening and in real time as well.
So I think the main thing is to try to see, what thing can I see that is, what speed bumps can I put in front of the attackers between the compromised account and really important systems. And also, for example, for a tier 0 admin, they probably can take some extra friction. There you can take the cost of having non-phishable MFA and just say that, sorry, you have to have a non-phishable to be tier 0 admin, and you have to use a secured workstation, And then on the other hand, say that, I cannot implement all of these controls on my 10,000 retail users or my 10,000 factory.
There might be temp staff, right? You get who might just be there for maybe days sometimes, right? During Christmas peak, I'm sure you hire people a lot more during that time.
I would also recommend using some form of a regression testing on your policies. So Meister, for example, is a fantastic tool.
Nice.
Just to have this kind of, safety net, because it's very easy when you walk around, you have to make a change to policy and,
Yes.
And it's usually not you who do it. It's usually someone, a couple of layers away from you that makes the day-to-day changes. Right. And if there's no checking, it's very easy to make a mistake that sits there for, weeks, months before someone discovers that. But wait a minute, this group of people don't get MFA. Why?
Yes. No one will complain, right? When they don't get an MFA, they'll be happily using.
They will be happy as
their long token.
Yeah. So I think that is Meister is really good, and also anything you can do to visualize this is really useful. Venn diagrams are always good, but it's problematic when you start getting too many dimensions to this to understand the Venn diagrams.
And there's a lot with sign-in frequency to name location
and devices and etc. And the edge cases can always be complex and kind of indirect things like SSPR is a fantastic tool, although the usability perhaps needs a little bit more work. It would be good to improve that. But in general, SSPR is great. But let's say that you have a group that uses certificate-based login. And you put them in SSPR. They don't have an MFA apps, so they cannot use SSPR. But once they log in with their certificate, they're going to get the, hey, please register for MFA. Oh, well,
Yes.
okay. Didn't really
And for
work.
those who are listening who don't know what SSPR is, I'm sure like 90%, 95 of you know, but for those who are coming in new to Entra, so SSPR is self-service password reset. It's one of the, I think the very first Entra feature that was rolled out that lets you, I think the first premium or the paid version in Azure AD, where users can self-service reset their passwords by using either MFA or security questions, which you shouldn't be using anymore, and then being able to reset your password using just the web interface. And it was like very new at that time to just go to a web page and be able to change your password for a corporate things.
And one thing to watch on the conditional access is also that usually you drive most conditional access from groups. But then comes the question, who has the right to switch the group memberships?
Yes.
So in an enterprise, you can get either if you use sync groups or cloud-only groups, but you very quickly could get like to 100, 200, 300 users who can change group memberships. So using lockdown groups where you give it to only a small, some service accounts that goes in your RDA system or some way of shrinking that attack surface is a really good thing to do.
Yes. And we have new capabilities as well to secure the groups with administrative units and other things which we've spoken about. So there are ways you can make sure that these groups are a bit more controlled and they're not open to anyone who has maybe a group admin privilege to manage conditional access related groups.
And this is a very interesting area. And of course, you got the whole PIM setup as well. So it's something where you need to really read up on all the different features and advantages and disadvantages before you pick the right choice for you.
Yes, yeah, there are sometimes many ways to do things, and then like there are new capabilities that come in as well, and then you need to know what you do, right? So you keep on top of things. We had like the device for devices, we introduced the device filters, and so you could start using those sorts of dynamic queries for device filters, and apps got the whole custom security attribute. So before you would have just picked apps, and now you can do it in a new way. And then you sort of need to go back and revisit at some point, right, your conditional access policies and say, okay, how do we now make it more streamlined and make it more modern so you can use the new capabilities that are there in Entra.
And the same can also be said for the kind of the end-to-end life cycle for your users, that the importance of doing a proper identity proofing on the users in the key lifecycle events. So when you onboard, for example, and here I know there's some very interesting stuff coming in from Microsoft that looks very promising, and also some very interesting cooperation between Microsoft and the identity proofing vendors.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes, so
very interesting space.
Verified ID and face check were some of the new ones. I think today a new video dropped as well on how face check works for different scenarios as well, from employee onboarding and those identity proofing and so on.
And of course, here you also have the classical that a challenge is to make sure that you can only register out devices if you have, for example, if either you have a tap or you're on-premise or something, so that you don't have the situation where the attacker managed to phish your session with MFA in it, and then happily registers their own authentication device, and suddenly they can then go and do a SSPR, and they've persisted themselves in the system, and they lower the risky user. So it's one-stop shop for the attacker.
Yes,
Get everything they need.
Correct. Yeah, all this it's always the catch, right? The whole whether it's an inactive app, inactive user, and that stresses the importance of governance and being on top of your tenant, so you don't leave those avenues open to attackers.
Yeah, if the attacker attacks a active account, at least then probably the user will go like, hey, why can't I log in anymore?
Exactly. Right.
But of course, in any given tenant, there's always people who are going to be on vacation. or are going to be out on parental leave or other reasons that can get you days, weeks, months of free reign for the attacker. So
Yes, that's true. Absolutely. And people get scared the first time in small orgs. What happens is they do all this, then the CEO flies off somewhere and then he can't access because you put a country level conditional access, and then he's not happy, and suddenly you have to remove everything back, not just that one exception. So
yeah, at least it's a little bit better. I once managed to, I had an entire um, the leadership team was flying to a country far away, and we had built, given them burner laptop and burner
nice. You all
everything,
Yes.
I thought this time we thought about everything, and then they get there and they try to do MFA, and it turns out that SMS provider didn't support this country, so
They couldn't sign in.
couldn't do anything. So I felt very stupid, and I got yelled at a bit for that. But
So they just had like dead laptops.
they were very nice door stops or something. That's the only thing it could be used for.
Well, you can't always plan for everything, right? And we learn from those, right, over time.
So I think there's a couple of things also that I think may or may not happen. So one thing that would be very nice to see would be, so we've done a great job on the writing part for groups, for example, for data. One thing that isn't really in place yet is for the reading part. So if you get an account with permission, you get to read all the users, and that is a bit of a challenge if what you want to do is to be able to read 5% of the users.
Right.
So I don't know if there's any plans for doing anything about that, but that is something really nice.
Yes, yeah, that's always a challenge with the permissioning, and with the application permission levels, you get sort of overall read access, and with Azure AD and domain controllers, it's always been sort of open. People had access to the global address list on every device in Outlook, right? And that's been the model. But there have been some improvements in different areas. So teams have this new capability called resource specific constraint, RSC. So you can limit to which teams the app has permissions. Exchange has the exchange access policy as well. So yeah, different products are doing some of those siloing, like sort of instead of complete vertical access to all the identities, you can scope it down to specific identities. But yeah, there's definitely room for improvement in that area. Because I've heard from vendors as well, like they're building a product and they don't want access to all the identities. They just need to maybe some of them. But then way the application permission works is it opens it out to all of them. Like there are no other option other than requesting that.
It would be very handy if it was possible to restrict reading rights, for example, against specific AUs or something like that. That you can only read things that are in specific AU.
Correct.
Because sometimes you work together with a partner and you're really only interested in 2%, 5% of the users in their tenant, and sure, you can get read rights to everything.
Yeah.
I don't want that. I really don't want to be able to read all of that stuff.
That's true.
And of course, you have also privacy concerns like GDPR and so on. And somewhere you're probably getting to a point where it becomes a bit fishy with if you really should be able to read all this data.
Yes, absolutely. That's an important area.
Another thing I do know that you're working on is the phishing-resistant MFA setup, and it's really been improved, but I think it still needs a little bit of work, especially if you look at the Android side, to be able to fail a little bit more gracefully if the Android is not able to support the passkey.
Right. So how are you planning for deploying passkeys right now? Are you doing like pilot testing things?
So I think just like everyone else, we're doing pilots, and what we do see, and I spoke about this on a couple of conferences over the years as well. The challenge is that it's not graceful. Like the problem right now is that if you push this out, you're gonna see that a fair amount of users are gonna have pre-Android 14 where it's not going to work at all.
Right.
Some, like for example, my phone is Android 14, but it still doesn't work. But it doesn't say anything useful to me that tells me that the problem is the phone. So the problem is that if you push out passkeys to a large organization that doesn't necessarily have the latest phone to everyone all the time, you're just going to have your poor support desk being
The support
drowned in
desk.
support
Yes.
requests.
Yeah. They wouldn't be happy if you
Yeah.
did a rollout that way. What are your thoughts on? Obviously, we know syncable passkeys are coming as well, and Entra today supports device bound, but it's already been mentioned that Entra will support syncable keys as well. So, where do you stand on the whether you will allow syncable or not, or whether it will be only device bound?
So I think it depends on what your role is in the company. So if you're a tier 0 admin, you probably want to be device bound because, yes, it's inconvenient, it takes time, but it provides the extra protection. On the other hand, if you're a frontline user,
Yes.
syncable all the way because that
Yeah.
will make your life easier and make your help desk life easier and in the end increase productivity. So
Nice.
I think it's a good tool to have the different options, and in different situations, different approaches are appropriate.
Nice. Yeah, that's valid, right? You wouldn't want to do a one for all sort of policy. Some orgs try to do like one for all, and depending on the industry they are in, if like they need to do it, so they would go for the the most strictest option. But yeah, it's good to see, especially when you deal with frontline workers, you are always a bit more forgiving because your revenue and lot depends on them doing their work and not doing IT, not being stuck in doing password resets or trying to sign into things. Yeah.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's all about realizing that you're here to serve the customers and making sure that they get a good experience at a price that they can afford, basically. So you need to be appropriate on the level of security boundaries you put on things.
Cool. Awesome.
I do hope also that Microsoft will embrace a little bit more the SSF and the CAPE and similar standards, because it does seem it's going to be very interesting to see the Interop in London in about a month's time.
Yep.
To see if we're actually getting to a point where it is kind of practically applicable. But I think we're almost there now, or we are already there. So it's a little bit of, it could be that Microsoft is going to go down the same kind of rabbit hole that you did 10 years ago or so when you had your VS security stack that was Microsoft specific, and then everyone else went with the SAML and standards. So if I can make a wish, I would like you to consider embracing these protocols.
Nice. Yeah, absolutely. We'll see what happens. Cool. It was so awesome. Good to talk with you, Martin. The time just flew past. I do have like one last question for you. For someone who's like coming new into identity, if there are folks listening, they are doing some other cybersecurity and coming in, what advice would you give them to, improve their knowledge and, move into IAM identity as a sort of a career move?
So I think there is actually the IAM community is quite open and welcoming to new people, and there is a lot of really good material. There's everything from really good podcasts like Identity Center, all the work that you're doing, for example, also, and also we have IDPro, Global Identity Organization. There's lots of consider joining that. And there's a huge amount of conferences. I've actually have a GitHub with trying to follow the conferences that are kind of in Northern Europe. And there's a lot of both conferences, and if you're an end user organization, you can usually get cheap or free tickets. There is also all of the meetups and the IdentiBeer, where I'm running.
Oh yeah, that's
Amsterdam
something I see
chapter.
you posting about all the time. IdentiBeer, right? Is it IdentiBeer or
So it's IdentiBeer, yes. So we have meetups. Kind of the idea is that to make things just simple, that you can just go there and talk to people, and it's been quite successful, and we have chapters in a lot of different places in both in Europe and US.
Oh, nice. We should. I don't think we have one in Australia yet, so
we have to start one there.
Definitely look at starting that. Yes. Nice. Perfect. Thank you so much. You are a wealth of knowledge and experience, and thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your journey and how you're using it.